Why would an all-powerful God, who truly loves us, permit such suffering to overwhelm our living existence? And this problem for religion is called, as you'll likely know, the problem of evil. But there's something missing from this picture. I'm not just here to restate the problem of evil as if it's anything new. There's something else. There exists such an obvious and overwhelming version of the problem of evil that it bemuses me that so many philosophers leave it entirely out of the discussion, or at best relegate it to a passing paragraph or a footnote or something. I'm talking, of course.
All right, let's try to get this in one take. Let's go.
All right, so I want to react to Alex O'Connor's video titled Christianity's Biggest Problem. This title kind of caught my attention, and the video itself was interesting to watch. I'm going to include the full video in the description box below for those who want to watch the video in its entirety. In this reaction video, I'm going to play a few clips and share my thoughts on them. Now, before we begin, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so. My goal is to reach like 300 subscribers before the end of this year. Also, don't forget to like this video if you want to see more content like this. And if you find this type of content helpful, consider sharing it with your friends. Sharing is always a good idea, right? So without further ado, let's jump into today's video.
Now, I know that it's quite a bold claim that I've made in the title to have put my finger on the single biggest problem that Christianity as a religion faces. But let me explain. I want to put forward in this video what I think is the hardest objection to respond to if you're a Christian. Now, as you'll probably already know, the most famous problem that you have if you want to say that the Christian God, that is, an all-loving, all-powerful God, exists, is the positively colossal amount of suffering infused into the human experience. Suffering is so omnipresent that most of our time spent existing is time spent trying to avoid it. Eating to avoid starvation, working to avoid poverty, sleeping to avoid fatigue, watching YouTube videos to avoid whatever it is that you're supposed to be doing right now. And that's when things are going well in life. God also throws into the bargain of living existence, which nobody agrees to enter into, by the way, unpredictable diseases, miscarriages, natural disasters, and the existence of TikTok. Why would an all-powerful God, who truly loves us, permit such suffering to overwhelm our living existence? And this problem for religion is called, as you'll likely know, the problem of evil. But there's something missing from this picture. I'm not just here to restate the problem of evil as if it's anything new. There's something else. There exists such an obvious and overwhelming version of the problem of evil that it bemuses me that so many philosophers leave it entirely out of the discussion, or at best relegate it to a passing paragraph or a footnote or something. I'm talking, of course, about the problem of animal suffering. Now, before you think I'm just getting all vegan on you again, don't worry, that's not what this is. I know how sensitive some of you are to me pointing out that our own treatment of animals is so poor that it almost reaches godlike proportions. But that's not what I'm here to talk about today. Animals suffering in factory farms, for instance, can easily be explained away by the Christian as a result of human free will. I'm talking about something else. I'm talking about the suffering of animals that isn't human created. The suffering that exists in the wild as a result of natural processes. And by the way, the reason this video is called Christianity's Biggest Problem specifically, rather than just religion's biggest problem, is because I actually think that some other religions, like Islam, have bigger problems than animal suffering. But animal suffering is still a problem for other religions like Islam. So although in this video I'm going to respond to William Lane Craig, a Christian, on the subject, do bear in mind that these arguments should apply to any God who claims to be morally perfect. So this is the basis of my claim. If the problem of suffering is historically one of Christianity's biggest problems, then the problem of animal suffering is its biggest. So I should probably begin by unpacking why animal suffering is such a problem.
All right, so in the next clip that I'm going to share, Alex is going to provide us with his list of reasons why he believes that animal suffering is Christianity's biggest problem. I love the little joke that he put in there about TikTok being one of the evils in this world. I'll try not to jump ahead in my response to this first clip. But firstly, I just want to acknowledge that, Alex is absolutely correct in pointing out that the issue of animal suffering is one of the most challenging objections for Christians to address. And I believe this is not because it is inherently difficult to find the answer to, but rather because atheists and agnostics don't typically often use this objection as frequently as they use the existence of evil or human suffering. Right. So one interesting observation that I'm starting to make as I listen to these various arguments from atheists and agnostics is that they have the easiest and most arrogant position on earth. Their entire religious stance is based on doubt. Now, although they may claim not to be religious as indicated by the term atheist, I would argue that they are. Their God is themselves. They believe that they possess the highest form of knowledge and wisdom rather than God. And they believe they alone define good and evil, not God. And they believe that they are the ones who give meaning to their own lives and not God. In the Christian worldview, faith in God is considered the highest virtue, whereas in the atheistic worldview, doubt in God is considered to be the highest virtue. Now, I know that does not particularly answer Alex's topic at hand. Like I said, I will let him give his arguments first, and then I'm going to respond to them. But I wanted to point out that before we get started, because I thought it was very interesting to point out. Again, I know some atheists will say things like, I want there to be God, but every time I look for the evidence for one, it's just not there. But to that, I will say, look, please cut the crap, right? There are plenty of pieces of evidence for the existence of God. The problem is that the existence of God is in direct competition with your current religious disposition. As I already laid out for you, if God is God, then that means you are not. And that means you're not as smart or as all wise as you really think you are. Now, I want to be clear on something. I have nothing against Alex or any other atheist, agnostic, or whatever you want to call yourself, right? But I do want to call a spade a spade. I want to skip all the hoopla and get straight to the heart of the issue, which is that you are too prideful to see the clear and obvious evidences for the existence of God, and that arrogance blinds you to the reality of God, and worst of all, to the reality of yourself. But for the sake of this video, let's put that to the side for now, and let's move on to the reasons that Alex gives for the reason why animal suffering is Christianity's biggest problem.
Worth addressing in the first place. If human life is, as I've argued, infused with pain, then non-human animal life is defined by pain. Animals in the wild are subject to endless torment from all angles of their existence. They suffer from predation by other animals. Wild dogs disembowel their prey. Venomous snakes cause slow internal bleeding and paralysis. Crocodiles drown large animals in their jaws. Right? And animals also suffer from rampant disease, dehydration, and starvation. They have to contend with forest fires and floods and a whole manner of other terrifying natural disasters. David Attenborough, the celebrated nature documentary filmmaker, once said about his documentaries, "People who accuse us of putting in too much violence should see what we leave on the cutting room floor." Nature just really isn't a pretty place, and not only do wild animals suffer in these extravagant ways that humans generally do not, like having to live with the very real possibility of being mauled to death at practically any moment, it's also true that compared to humans, an astronomically higher number of wild animals exist. So unfathomably high, in fact, that we can only estimate how big that number actually is. The number of wild vertebrates alone is thought to be somewhere between 10 to the power of 11 and 10 to the power of 14. That's 10 with at least 11 zeros after it. We're talking trillions of animals, each one of whom will, under the unerring supervision of an all-powerful, all-loving God, likely experience more fear, devastation, and suffering in their lifetimes than we human beings are even capable of imagining. So this is the problem that the Christian has to contend with. How can God permit such insidious levels of unthinkable suffering? Well, it's not like Christians don't have a response to the problem of evil. There are many quite famous attempts to reconcile the existence of evil with a loving God. The problem is that a great many of these attempts, which are known as theodicies, by the way, simply don't apply to non-humans. For instance, one popular theodicy states that evil and suffering exists as a result of human free will. Right? If humans are genuinely free, they'll sometimes commit and permit evil. But this doesn't explain why a tree falls onto a deer's leg, causing it to starve to death in confused agony. Right? It's also sometimes asserted that human suffering is justified because it will be compensated for in the afterlife. But unless you believe in some doggy heaven, or that Jesus died for the sake of your pet hamster's sins too, this also doesn't really fly for animals. It's also sometimes said that suffering exists because from it more good can emerge. But what good emerges from animal suffering? And how does it benefit the animals? Most animals are non-rational creatures. They can't learn and intellectually grow in the same way that humans can. What greater good could possibly be served by allowing a koala bear to be burned alive in an Australian wildfire? Well, fear not, because in 2011, two very eloquent philosophers, Stephen Law and William Lane Craig, both previous guests on this channel, by the way, debated God's existence. Dr. Law brings up the problem of animal suffering, and so we can now turn our attention to what Dr. Craig often cites.
So I don't want to necessarily get into the Stephen Law and William Lane Craig debate. Really, I want to deal with Alex's, arguments at hand. So before I begin to explain why I don't believe that animal suffering is Christianity's biggest problem, I want to acknowledge that my answer may not be sufficient for atheists or agnostics, right? Their goal is often not to truly engage with the arguments presented, but rather to find more reasons to doubt, right? However, again, we're going to put all of that to the side for right now, and let's address the issue of animal suffering. So Alex begins this section by providing a detailed description of how animals, particularly predators, can mistreat other animals. And he emphasizes that their lives are often characterized by pain and suffering caused by natural factors or other means, right? Alex distinguishes the issue of animal suffering from human suffering and argues that while Christians may attribute, human suffering to free will, this explanation does not hold for situations like a tree falling on a deer's leg, leading to starvation, right? Now, before I move forward, I will actually like to address Alex's initial point, which is that I believe that Alex's lack of understanding of the Christian worldview becomes apparent here, which hinders his ability to truly grasp why Christians who truly comprehend their faith, right, do not view this as a significant challenge to the existence of God or religion, right? It is important to clarify that this does not mean that we dismiss the problem of animal suffering. Rather, we do not consider it to be the strongest objection to the Christian faith. You see, what Alex and every other atheist or agnostic needs to understand about the Christian worldview is that we acknowledge the presence of a meta-narrative in our world. And a meta-narrative, for those who don't know, refers to an overarching account or interpretation of events and circumstances that provides a pattern or a structure for people's beliefs and gives meaning to their experiences. In more simpler terms, it is the narrative that overlaps and gives meaning to the other narratives of every living creature on earth, including animals, right? As Christians, we recognize that the biblical narrative can be summarized by four themes: the creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, okay? What Alex and many other atheists and agnostics often focus on in an attempt to disprove the existence of God is the concept of the fall, right? That's the one theme that's in the biblical narrative. That's why if God is so good, that's why they question things like, if God is so good, why is there so much evil, pain, and suffering in the world, right? They wonder about the reasons behind these various events. And it's understandable because they're asking these questions to continue to wrestle with them because their primary focus on one section of the biblical narrative, which is the fall, right? They're focused on all the negative aspects of that part of the narrative. So before we address the problem of animal suffering, we need to acknowledge that in the creation part of the biblical narrative, animal suffering was not an issue, right? In fact, suffering in general was not an issue. Everything was perfect. God called everything that he created good. Now, Alex may object and ask, if God created everything perfect, why didn't it stay that way? And that's a good question, right? Cue the fall, right? When Adam and Eve and the serpent disobeyed and rebelled against God, they introduced sin, suffering, pain, and death into the world. This corruption did not just affect humans, but it spread throughout the entire world including animals. You might wonder, what does Adam's sin have to do with animals suffering, right? And the answer is everything. Adam was not only the legal representative for his wife, Eve, but he was the legal representative for all of creation. And this is important for both atheists, agnostics, and Christians to understand if they're truly going to deal with the problem of animal suffering. Adam was just not the federal head of humanity, but of all creation. In 1 Corinthians 15:22, it actually states that for as in Adam, all die, right? The word all refers to all of creation. Adam's sin affected all of creation. Now, for the atheists and agnostics, this is where their understanding kind of stops, right? All they see is the negative consequences that Adam's sin has brought into the world, and the hardships of life, blind them from seeing the complete biblical narrative, again, our meta narrative. However, for Christian, the story does not end here. This is where we transition to the next theme, redemption. Now, I understand that Alex made a joke about, Jesus dying for the sins of a pet hamster or something similar to that. And I get it, right? It seems illogical to connect the two. Why would my hamster need Jesus to atone for his sins? And what sins has my hamster committed? Like, why does my hamster have to suffer pain and need Jesus's, death on the cross, right? But once again, I would argue that Alex is not truly engaging with a Christian worldview. Instead, he is approaching it with an atheistic perspective. And since he does not believe in God, he's only seeing the partial picture, if that, right? So what I want to do right now is I want to visit 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 22 again, because I didn't read the entire verse in its entirety, right? The complete verse says this, and let me pull it up for us real quick. It says, "For as in Adam all die, also in Christ shall all be made alive." Here, all refers again to all of creation, not just humanity. And the story of redemption includes the entirety of creation, again, not just humans. In Colossians chapter 1, verses 15 through 20, Paul actually says this, and let's go to that. It's talking about the preeminence of Christ here. So it says, "He is the image of the invincible God, the firstborn of all creation. For by him all things were created in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning, the firstborn from the dead, that in everything he might be preeminent. For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of the cross," right? Now, I don't believe I have time to kind of go through this passage, verse by verse, exegetically, right? That will have to be for another day or another video or another series. But for now, I kind of want to draw attention to a few things in this passage. So in verse 15, notice how Jesus is called the firstborn of all creation. The important point here is that it applies to all creation. Again, not just humans, but everything in existence. As we continue reading, Paul actually tells us that, all things, including animals, were created through Jesus and for him. And then lastly, Paul ends this paragraph by assuring us that he will reconcile all things, animals included, both on earth and in heaven. So that includes angels, right? That includes different spiritual beings, right? That includes humans, that includes animals, right? That includes all of creation. That includes the plants, trees, everything in the earth, right? And how will he accomplish this? It tells us at the end in verse 20, making peace by the blood of the cross, of Jesus' cross. So through the blood of Jesus' cross is how he's going to accomplish this reconciliation, right? Now, I want to pause here because I know some of you maybe thinking, but that doesn't make any sense, right? And to that, I would respond, yeah, I agree. To us humans, it may not make any sense because our minds have been deeply affected by the noetic effects of sin, right? However, to God, this makes perfect sense. And this is actually what Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, that the foolishness of God is wiser than humans, and the weakness of God is stronger than humans. This means that no matter how wise or how strong you think you are, God is wiser and stronger than you. But again, the story does not end here, right? We still have one last part of the biblical narrative: restoration. Now, to explain this part, I actually want to read what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 18, verses 20, Romans chapter 8, verses 18 through 24. And let me go to that real quick. So it says this: "For I consider that sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. For the creation waits with eager longing for the revealing of the sons of God. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. And not only the creation, but we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for adoption as sons, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we are saved. Now hope that is seen is not hope, for who hopes what he sees? But if we hope for what we do not see, we wait for it with patience." Right? So again, notice how Paul does not just relegate this future glory to man, to humankind, right? He includes all of creation in this picture. Yes, Alex, that includes your pet hamster too, right? As foolish that may seem to you, this is part of the biblical narrative. God's plan is to make all things right. His plan was always to restore his good world back to its original state of perfection and goodness. And look, if you're watching this video, God wants you to be a part of that future glory as well. You can continue to see the world through the same lens as Alex, one that is marked with pain, suffering, and turmoil, or you can see it through God's lens, understanding the whole biblical narrative, the whole meta narrative that gives meaning to your narrative through the lens of the creation, the fall, redemption, and restoration. So anyways, guys, that's the video. I know I only played a portion of Alex's video, but that's because he started to go into some of arguments that William Lane Craig gave way back when, which I thought were not necessarily the best arguments in defense of Christianity. So I didn't necessarily want to go down that rabbit trail. You know, you kind of get it, rabbit trail, animal stuff. Anyway, there are other questions that I do believe will naturally spring forth from a conversation like this, such as, you know, why did God create a world where he knew there would be suffering in the first place? And what about evil, and so on and so forth. Look, let me know in the comment section if you would like me to make videos on those questions as well. And also, again, don't forget to please like, share, subscribe, as it does help out the channel a lot. But until next time, guys, peace.